Michael Ware is an Australian journalist and former war correspondent for CNN and Time magazine, as well as a columnist for the Daily Beast, and who's reported from Iraq, Beirut, Paris, Pakistan, Mexico, and more. Michael has just finished a presentation on the rise of the Islamic State. Thank you very much for your insight this evening.
Mate, it was my pleasure, thank you.
So over the past 2 months, we've seen the Islamic State, or ISIS, seize territory the size of the United Kingdom and carry out the slaughter of Christians, Yazidis, and Shiites. They've been called the most successful terror group in history, and they've carved out a quasi-state or caliphate throughout 2 countries. What's their current status?
Well, it's exactly as you say. They have redrawn the borders of the Middle East, single-handedly. They have torn up the map and created their own country in defiance of the international community. It's a country that they now control. It's a country they now effectively govern. I mean, it's a stunning historical feat that they have managed to achieve.
It looks as though the West will be intervening in an attempt to halt the organisation's gains. How successful do you see such an action being, given the complete lack of political and societal will for intervention, especially after the past decade or so?
Well, there's many forms of intervention. What we're looking at this stage in terms of Western intervention has been the provision of arms and training and some intelligence to Iraqi forces of one kind or another on the ground. Also, there's been the delivery of humanitarian aid across northern Iraq, and most spectacularly to trapped Yazidi community at a certain point. Beyond that though, the West's ability to make a real impact upon the Islamic State is extremely limited. I mean, even with the almost 200 airstrikes that have taken place so far from the Americans, that in no way significantly degrades the Islamic State's capabilities either militarily or politically. What ultimately is going to be required in one form or another to roll back the Islamic State's advances on the ground is some kind of military offensive. That means troops on the ground to try and combat the Islamic State forces. Now, there isn't a country in the West that's going to provide those forces. So where will those forces come from? This is a great problem. You cannot win wars from the air, yet militarily, that's kind of what the West is limited to.
So the Islamic State has seized resources, including dams and oil fields, allowing them to have some financial independence. How significant is this, particularly given their split with Al-Qaeda earlier this year?
Well, he who holds the terrain, controls the world there, don't they? I mean, the fact that the Islamic State not only has been able to seize key infrastructure throughout the area that they control, even more than that, they've been able to maintain it by and large. The workers who have been running power plants, or the workers who have been maintaining roads and performing essential government functions, quite often we're seeing them brought back by the Islamic State to continue their work. I mean, this is the nature, isn't it, of a state. And they're delivering on that in one way or another.
So the Islamic State formally split with Al-Qaeda earlier this year. How do these two organisations differ from one another?
Look, at their very heart, old school Al-Qaeda of Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri and the Islamic State that we see today have almost as many differences as they do have similarities. The Islamic State believes in sectarian war, principally targeting the Shia world. That has not been a key part of old school Al-Qaeda's strategic platform. The methodology of the Islamic State is also something that we've seen since the creation of the Islamic State that old school Al-Qaeda has not been able to tolerate. So it's a matter of strategy, it's a matter of tactics, it's a matter of methods where these two organisations divide. Let's not forget that when the Islamic State was created by its founder, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, his methods were seen to be so extreme that The Al-Qaeda of Osama bin Laden believed them to be counterproductive and openly urged him to curb some of his worst excesses. And Zarqawi ignored bin Laden and old school Al-Qaeda and carried on as he has done so. So when in February this year we saw a formal split of any affiliation, even as loose as it was, between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, that was not something new. In fact, it was the rupturing of a fault line that had been there all along.
In a recent interview with The Drum, you mentioned your view that the West should ally themselves with Iran. And former Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was heavily sectarian during his time in power, allying himself with Tehran and alienating Sunni tribes to the extent that they assisted the Islamic State in their initial Iraq operations. Wouldn't such an alliance simply continue the sectarian bloodshed that we've seen since 2003?
Look, I don't think it's possible to forge an actual alliance with Iran. I don't think it's there to be had. However, to the extent that it exists, there is a certain alignment of interests between Washington and Tehran. We've seen similar alignments in the past. We saw those two countries at least indirectly cooperate to a small degree in Bosnia. We certainly saw those two countries cooperate much more actively to bring down the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. We then saw Washington and Tehran with their interests coming into conflict as both competed for influence in Iraq throughout the 10 years of the American presence there. Look, at the end of the day, to tackle organisations like the Islamic State, you may end up working with people or with nation-state actors who you may not otherwise agree with. But it's along the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it's not the first time the West has had to work with some unpalatable characters or regimes, and I can guarantee you it won't be the last.
Continuing on that point, what do you make of the view that the events in Syria and Iraq over the past 3 years are simply a proxy battle between the Shiite Republic of Iran and the Sunni Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar?
Look, that's one thing about this region, is that everyone has their hands in the pie. Certainly we saw during the American war in Iraq, a whole variety of groups had a whole array of external sponsors. We saw the Egyptians play a hand, obviously the Jordanians, the Syrians, even by doing nothing, had some role in the Iraq war. Obviously Iran was very active. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. I mean, the great risk has always been, with a failure of American intervention in Iraq, was essentially the risk of a regional proxy war atop 1, 2 or 3 of the world's largest oil reserves. And that threat has not gone away.
Lastly, you had the pleasure of being kidnapped by the Islamic State's precursor organisation, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Why do they so love to brutally murder journalists?
Well, it's got you talking about it, doesn't it? It certainly captures the world's attention. It captures the West's attention. It captures the region's attention. And it captures the attention of their faithful and their prospective recruits. For them, I'm not sure that they see a downside to the targeting and killing of journalists, even televised.
Michael, thanks for your time this
Thank
evening.
you. Appreciate it.